Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Sara Freeman for celebrating the release of her book, Tides, in conversation with Joanna Rakoff. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. And if this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. It's so great to have all of you join this community this evening, and we so appreciate your support of our lovely authors and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. And now allow me to introduce our wonderful authors that we have here tonight. Tonight's moderator, Joanna Rakoff, is a journalist, poet, critic, and novelist. She is the author of the novel A Fortunate Age, winner of the Goldberg Prize for Fiction, the Elle Readers Prize, and a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller. She is also the author of the international best-selling memoir, My Salinger Year, which has been adapted into film. She's a frequent contributor for the New York Times, Vogue, Marie Claire, and the Oprah magazine, among others. Joanna, it is so lovely to have you here with us tonight. And tonight's author, Sara Freeman, is a Montreal-born writer currently based out of Boston. She graduated from Columbia University with an MFA in fiction, where she was a writing fellow and a teaching fellow. At Columbia, she won the Henfield Prize for the best piece of short fiction by a graduate student. She's taught writing in Columbia's University Writing Program at the Fashion Institute of Technology, SUNY, and Emerson College. She's received scholarships from the Breadloaf Writers Workshop, and her work has been previously published online in a number of literary magazines, including LitHub, Granta, and Joyland. She is also an instructor and a consultant at Grub Street. Tides is her first novel, and I'm going to tell you a little about it. Tides is an astonishingly powerful portrait of a deeply unpredictable woman who walks out of her life and washes up in a seaside town. After a sudden devastating loss, Mara flees her family and ends up adrift in a wealthy seaside town with a dead cell phone and barely any money. Mired in her grief, Mara detaches from the outside world and spends her days of self-imposed exile scrounging for food and swimming in the night ocean. In her state of emotional extremis, the sea at the town's edge is rendered bleak, luminous, implacable. The Tides has been released to critical acclaim, carrying the cue of shelf awareness, called it a stunning and revelatory debut, and in a starred review, Publishers Weekly called it a moving story about grief, love, and memory with beautiful and translucent prose. I am so excited to hear Sara talk about it, and I'm sure you all are as well. Everyone, please make some noise in the chat for Sara Freeman and Joanna Rakoff. Hooray.
Hi. So I'm just going to speak for 2 seconds, and then Sara's going to read. I just want to say how excited I am to talk with Sara about Tides. It's a novel that I found so polished and so precise in all ways that I honestly couldn't believe it was a debut. I read a lot of novels, and it did not feel like a debut at all to me. It's a really perfect novel, and it's beautiful and heart-wrenching and just kind of transformative. And it also has an element of mystery. I found myself gasping as bits and pieces of revelations came out throughout the course of the novel. I read a whole bunch of reviews of it just in the last couple of days, and I just want to quote from a couple of others. Emma Klein, who blurbed it, who's a writer I love, and I think a lot of you guys probably love, just described it as brilliant. She said many other things, but she called it brilliant, and I feel like that's really all you need to know. And Kirkus Reviews, whom Bonnie mentioned, called it intense and lyrical, which feels so apt to me, and also praised its narrative restraint and unsettling effect, which were things that I love too. And I just also want to mention that the Globe assigned a review of it to, or published a review of it by one of my favorite critics, Michelle Filgate. And she just raved about it. I'm not going to quote from it because I just kind of wanted to read the whole review. I just felt like she really understood it on this kind of cellular level. But you should, many of you, or all you Boston people, should kind of take a look at that review after this is over. So Sara, I'm so excited to talk to you about the making of this novel and all sorts of other things. But first, can you read briefly for us?
I would love to. Thank you, Joanna, so much for being here with me, and to Brookline Booksmith for hosting us. So there isn't much to know, I think, at this point in the narrative. We're at the very beginning. The protagonist is as yet unnamed. She's left her home, her family, and she is in this seaside town that is also sort of a fictional seaside town at the tail end of the tourist season. She's staying in a hostel and she's running out of money. It is hot, the hottest day yet. August slinking into September, still hot by the evening when the sun is a red face dipping its chin into the water. The public beach is empty. Everyone is on their patios sipping Campari and eating pistachios, saying their farewells. She removes her canvas shoes, her jeans and shirt, and moves into the water, sharp and cold as a knife's edge. She swims out until, when she turns her head, she can no longer make out her clothes bundled up on the sand, just a single line of darkness in the background. The water is bitter now. The moon just a sliver in the night, barely any comfort at all. She is that sliver, she thinks, drowning in the dark. She could die here, so slight and sinking, nothing but her body to buoy her up. Whatever reserves she had, she has lost them now. She feels a rush of heat around her, her own urine, terror at her own thoughts. She thrashes around, trying to turn back, but even this turning, this changing course, seems impossible. The body has forgotten how to lead. It takes an eternity to move against the current, the arms and legs dumb with disuse and then too much exertion. She kicks hard and then softer. It is easier this way, without trying at all. She is moving forward and back, lulled by the waves. She is like this forever until she hits something, a rock, and then her knees hit it too, and she finds that she can crawl. Beneath her, the hard, wet certainty of the ground. She manages to get to her feet, finds her clothes in their pile, falls asleep in a damp heap. She wakes before the sun and sits up stiff and cold. She has always wanted this, to slip beneath the surface, to dispossess herself. Now that she has done it, it is hard to remember how herself could have become such a bottomless pit. Feed me, fuck me, fill me, love me. This is what it feels like to slip, she remembers telling her husband when she was teaching him to ice skate on the Ottawa Canal. You can't teach someone how to slip. He was right. You slip and then you've slipped, and so you know. Sometimes she pictures them, her brother and his wife, discussing her now that she is gone. Impossible, that's what they would say. Or maybe instead, beyond repair. The management has moved her things. You were gone for 2 nights, they tell her. She can remember only one, but she doesn't want to fight. Her things include a toothbrush, a sweater, 2 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans, the biography of a famous chef, all stuffed inside an old backpack with her brother's initials embroidered on it, P.S.T. They have placed her in the large dormitory. She can tell from the work boots neatly lining the beds that the place is full of men. She buys a 6-pack of beer and some cigarettes and brings them with her to the beach. She will wait until the men are sleeping before climbing back into her cot. She lies down. The beer and cigarettes are effective. She feels herself drifting pleasantly into the night. Today, she has only eaten half a packet of tea cookies and a banana. The waves are loud, brimming over, coursing to their violent meter. Before she falls asleep, she thinks, this is what babies must hear when they're held inside the womb.
Sarah, thank you. I'm so moved by so all of you out there who have not yet read the novel, now you understand why I was so moved by it and why I found it so devastating and affecting. And so I want to start off by asking you, I have so many questions, but I'm going to start with something that relates to the section you just read, which is Tides is so many things at once, but it's a sort of extraordinary portrait of a woman who abandons the trappings of middle-class life. And so I think I'm not giving anything away because it starts with this. She leaves home. She has a cell phone with her, but she doesn't want to use it because she doesn't want her family to find her. She has credit cards, but doesn't want to use them for the same reason. And she has cash, but she knows it's going to run out. She has almost no clothing, no possessions. And as we see in the section you just read, throughout the novel, which I'm just going to hold up here, because if we were in a bookstore, you would see like 100 copies of it. And so, for those of you out there here, this is actually the galley, my finished copy's downstairs, but looks the same. Throughout the novel, she's continually in these situations where she's really in danger, actually. She has no safety net at all. I mean, she's homeless, really. She's like on the cusp of being homeless in the section you read, and then she kind of gives over to being fully homeless. And I was wondering if this novel came out of an impulse to write about the dangers of being a woman alone in the world.
I do think so. I mean, I was certainly influenced by, movies and books that I read about women on their own, Vagabond, or these narratives where women are on the edge, and where her social network is somewhere else, and so she really doesn't have anything. She has, I think, $1,000 in her bank account, and I think I wanted it to be someone who was really towing the line of danger, kind of always on the edge. I mean, she's also quite lucky, right? In many ways, she finds a place to live. She is able to sort of slip into these situations quite seamlessly. And so she's that edgy place was what I was interested in, that liminal space of, is she alone? Is she homeless? And I think she wants to be in that in-between place herself. And so, I think I did play around with that a little bit. And I think that might be part of the sense of urgency in the book, is like, is she going to be okay? I'm not sure. And yeah, I mean, I was, at the time of writing it, I was actually also in Cambridge working with quite a few, or volunteering at a homeless shelter, and speaking to a lot of women who were homeless. And I think it did impact the way I thought of Mara as someone who had taken a step in one direction and ended up kind of in a pretty dangerous situation.
Yeah, yes. And I suppose there's a moment here again, I feel like I have to step back and say, this novel is quite brief, and there are so many just indelible moments in it, and moments of kind of revelation, not for Mara, but for the reader. And so I feel so hesitant to give away anything, but it's hard to talk about it without giving anything away. But there's a moment, when she hears this commotion in the street, she looks out and sees a couple, and she recognizes immediately that they are addicts of some sort or another. And she's sort of shaken by the sight of particularly the woman. And the woman leaves behind a piece of clothing, a sweatshirt, and Mara takes it and slips it on. And it feels like a moment of great sort of metaphorical significance. In a way, it's like she's saying, is this going to be me? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think she's someone who is, even her life in Montreal, although, it can be described as, she works in the service industry. She's someone who has always maybe felt a little bit on edge in some way because of her habits, because of her behaviors. And I think this coming to this town is the kind of crossing over for her, stepping into sort of a darker part of herself, and also dealing with this, what I think we can call trauma of some recent events that emerge in the narrative. And so I do think she sees a kind of double in this woman, and I don't think she is so far away from this woman. And I actually don't think that, I do think I was making a little bit or exploring the ways in which many of us who have experienced any form of mental health, crises, or are sort of on that edge sometimes. And so your question earlier of being a woman, is this about being a woman alone? I think it's about being a woman alone who is also struggling with a series of sort of psychological and existential questions.
Right. Yeah. Yes, it's true, because it's not just that she's alone due to circumstances, like she's chosen to put herself in some very dangerous situations. There's no other way to put it. But let me step back a little and ask you just about the seeds of this novel. Where did it come from? Where did it start?
So in some ways, it's a kind of I think of it as not, like a singular moment of, I saw this thing, or I saw this person, or I met this person, or I had an experience. But on the one hand, I had just spent many years trying to write another novel that was quite a bit more sort of socially realistic, very, multiple voices, really quite broad. Set in the 70s, and it spanned maybe like 25 years. It was really like ambitious. And I had a lot of trouble holding the whole thing together, basically, and making it come together. And I really realized it didn't work. And so in many ways, this project was my kind of pact with myself to write something a little bit more contained, that could have urgency, and that really followed a single subjectivity, and that was quite sort of psychological and internal. And then so that was a sort of like, I need to find a way to write a novel. And then on the other hand, I'd always wanted to write about adult siblings who are just so enmeshed that they can't really function in their adult lives. And so that was the sort of thematic seed. And I did start writing that story of these siblings, and it was set in Montreal, and I wrote it out in my regular kind of long form way, and lots of scenes and flashbacks, and then found that, after putting it aside, when I returned to it, it really lacked energy. I felt I had made the same sort of mistake I had made with the first novel. So I basically tried to find the like moments that had energy, and there were maybe, I don't know, like 10 sentences, 15 sentences where I was like, okay, you're onto something here, and you've got something, like the sound of these sentences, there's an atmosphere. And it so happened that those sentences were the ones that were set in the sort of at the later stage of the novel, when she has left. And so I realized, upon kind of really digging into this story, that I was more interested in this story as absence, the people who are gone around her. Who is this person without the trappings of home, without the relationships, and in the shadow of those relationships? And so I started again with that kind of, those few sentences, and this is how this became what it is, which was not at all what it was in the beginning.
Are the sentences in the book, which I'm holding up again?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And was there in that original novel, did it culminate in the Mara character being in this seaside town?
It did. It just was more, it was more interested in kind of like what happened before in a more linear fashion. And so I just felt like atmospherically, I couldn't really, there wasn't much happening in the Montreal scenes. But somehow in this town, alone with this character, which is the opposite of what you hear in a creative writing class. Put the character with other people, get them talking, get them moving around. Actually, I found her more interesting alone. So, I think that's part of the reason why it's also such a internal narrative.
Yeah, but a lot happens. I mean, I think a lot happens in this very short book, but I suppose it's funny. I mean, you hear such ridiculous, I just was talking about this in an interview I did. You're presented with so many rules in writing classes, and like one that has come up in conversations I've had with friends and in a writing group I'm in has been this idea that, you can't have too much backstory. You can't have too much backstory. No more backstory. It all has to be forward movement and forward action. But it's also ridiculous, right? Because you just have to write the novel that you need to write. You have to write what the hole that you sort of see in the world, you have to fill. But there is a way in which Tides is like that sort of other thing that people talk about, the whole, who is it? Wait, I have it right here. Oh, like the John Gardner. Oh my God, I'm pulling this off my bookshelf. The John Gardner thing of like, there are two stories in the world. A man goes on a journey and a stranger comes to town. So she's like both of those things, right? She's a woman goes on a journey and a stranger comes to town.
Yeah, John Gardner would be very disappointed.
Oh my God. So this leads me to a couple of questions. I mean, I think as far as I know, there are a number of writers in attendance tonight. So I think they might appreciate me asking you a little bit more about this. I mean, writing like basically 2 whole novels and then putting them aside and being like, this isn't working. There's no energy here. Like there's no heat here. This language just feels dead, is an extraordinary thing to do and an extraordinarily brave thing to do. And also something that kind of breaks a lot of rules. I feel like this is a moment in time, and maybe has been a moment in time. Like we went to the same MFA program as people. We both attended Columbia, where you're kind of pushed in this direction to kind of produce and publish. And, it kind of flouts a lot of conventional wisdom about how writers should be, that you should just produce and write every day, and everything should sort of work toward something you're going to sell or place somewhere. And what was that like for you to write these books and then be like, no, this isn't working, to spend years of your life doing something and then putting it aside?
It was very difficult because I think I struggled to think of myself as a writer, as I was so continuously failing to make something that could cohere. And I do think the book that Tides emerged from a sort of not a giving up, a kind of giving in, where I told myself, maybe this was like, I don't know, some weird game I was playing with myself, but I really did tell myself that it was okay if I couldn't do this, if I couldn't write, if I actually wasn't someone who could figure this out. It felt to me like I was not able to figure something out. And that was both extremely devastating, but I think probably also quite inspiring, in the sense that I was like, I must figure this out. And actually, I don't know if this is conveyed, to the reader, but when I re-encounter this text, or the way I think about it in my mind is like, there is that feeling of like, this needs to work, both for the character and somehow the parts coming together. And it felt like a lot was at stake for me as a person and as a writer writing this, because I had these really intensive experience of failure and of just false starts and of not quite getting it. And that was, I do think I wouldn't have it any other way. I think it just means that I knew so much about my character also, because I had written into her so much in these other ways. And so even though this is a very sort of, it has, there's not a lot of words, I felt that she was infused with a lot of knowledge from my work with her.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense, because she's such a fully realized character. There's so much kind of texture to her, and you just feel completely immersed in her from the first words. So maybe you needed to write those hundreds and hundreds of pages about her to get to this, and yeah, so that's so exciting to hear.
It's not the most efficient way of writing a novel, but it is the only way I really did know how to do it. So I'm so pleased that it came together. It's the big triumph.
I know you're not alone. I know. I mean, I certainly wrote hundreds of pages before starting the actual book of my Salinger year that I then just threw away to kind of figure out who the characters were. I mean, obviously they're real people, but anyway, and I know that that's so many people, but I think that making the choice to, understanding like that this is not that whatever novel, a whole novel is just not what you want it to be, and that you want something that sort of operates on a different and greater frequency is like an incredibly exciting and wonderful choice, and admirable. I feel like I wish more people would make that choice. And anyway, we're kind of flooded with novels that everyone doesn't want to. Well, okay, I'm going to stop talking. Anyway, about my thoughts about two novels to be out in the world. So Tides is kind of an excoriating portrait of grief, right? Mara is, so she's almost eviscerated by grief, by this devastating loss that she's had, which we find out throughout the course of the book, is compounded by other things. And here again, I keep asking you, where did this novel come from? And I wondered if that, if you set out to write about grief and loss, which is, of course, a particularly relevant subject right now. It's on everyone's minds after 2 years of everyone around us becoming very ill and dying. Or if that was just something that happened along the way, like a mechanism to get Mara into this desperate situation.
It's interesting. I don't think I did set out to write a book about grief and loss, but as I started sort of uncovering this character and her story, it seemed to me that something, I was sort of watching her in some way and thinking like something has happened to this person. There was, as I was sort of digging into these sort of psychological mechanisms and the things that these situations she kept repeatedly encountering, it seemed not only important that something happened to her, but also that her grief was something that was pre-existing. I think what this thing that happens to her, which all the reviewers give away, but we're not going to give it away, Joanna, in case someone hasn't read the book and also hasn't read any reviews so that they can get some pleasure out of the discovery. But so I knew there was a kind of culminating event, but I didn't want that to be the only thing that was pushing her out of her life. I think this is someone who has a lot of pre-existing grief and difficulty in her life that is sort of, yeah, I mean, sort of intensified in this one moment, but pre-exists and predates this one point, this one narrative moment.
I think it's going to ring true with a lot of people right at this moment, and maybe in general always. Okay, I have a few other questions, and then I see we have some questions from people out there, including one that I was going to ask, so I'm going to let someone else ask it. And I'm going to jump ahead to a sort of different subject, which is, and I may come back to the one thing we discussed a little, but I was interested in the role of identity, national, religious, ethnic, in the book. So I'll mention a couple of things. So you talked a bit about these previous novels, these kind of set aside novels being set in Montreal, where you are from. And Mara shares this with you. And it doesn't play a huge role in the book, except that she leaves Canada and comes to the US. And in the small town in which she settles, I know she's not really settled there, but I don't know what other word to use. She's perceived at certain points as being like a kind of, glamorous cipher, of Frenchness. And I think there's a bit of a perception of her being somewhat foreign in this town. And she does, I'm like giving away a tiny bit, but she takes a job at a wine, kind of like wine and charcuterie shop. And the owner for whom she works is also, not kind of New England WASP. He is Lebanese, right? Yes. Yeah, he's Lebanese, or Lebanese American. He was raised in the Midwest. And there's a way in which, these kind of two outsiders have a sort of bond that seems quite intense, and that it's never sort of made explicit that this is something they share. But anyway, I just was sort of intrigued in the ways in which identity kind of play into the book. It did occur to me, I kept thinking to myself, would this be a different book if Mara were American and she had, let's just say, like, fled Boston and moved 60 miles up the coast? And I came to the conclusion that it would actually be a very different book. So I was curious your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was, Mara's mother is from it's very briefly mentioned, but she's sort of from this area. And so it's a little bit of a kind of homecoming, although it's not a region that she knows well. And so there was that aspect, which is this is like somehow maternally connected, like this seaside sort of space is connected to her mother, and parts of her mother she doesn't really know that well. But certainly I think the connection with Simon, the shop owner, does have to do with the fact that they're both, they're not from this place. They're seen as outsiders, they're seen as different. And I think it makes their connection quicker and more intense. And I also think it sort of is, it's a differentiation between, the kind of person Mara is and the kind of person Simon's wife is, who is like super New England. Her dad almost owns this kind of town, is like, she's sort of the queen of this place. And so it's also a way for Simon to kind of explore some other side of himself by being with her, I guess. This outsider.
And how did you end up deciding to set the book in this seaside town, this fictional seaside town? Where did that come from? Is it based on a place or?
It's sort of based on a few different places. I think I did spend a little bit of time in the off season, just, on a like little, not for very long, on a little vacation. And I remember being very captivated by this town in Maine that just seemed so bleak, but I knew it to be this very kind of wealthy, like lively place in the summer. And I think we've all been to places like that. There's another town in Rhode Island that I've been to quite a few times that has that feeling of like just being so more itself in the off season and also not at all itself, which seemed obviously very appropriate for someone who is both very much herself in this crisis and not at all herself. And so it just, it felt like the right setting for someone who was in this liminal space.
Yeah. And that she arrives, not during the off season. And there's a way in which, I don't know, for me, one of the lovely kind of turns in the book is that you see her on the bus, just looking to go anywhere on the coast. She just wants to be at the ocean. And you kind of think like, oh, she's seeking solace in the ocean. And then as the season starts to turn, you see, no, she's not really, there's almost a kind of self-destructive, she's not aware of it, but there's a kind of destructive impulse that's bringing her there. And your expectations are kind of turned on their edge a little bit. But yeah, it definitely, the town I think will feel very familiar to anyone who is from or lives in New England. And I was thinking about places like Chatham on the Cape, where I have a friend who lives there year round, and has described it in certain, it's a very affluent town, or a town on the North Shore, like Ipswich, what have you. But okay, let me just see what we have. Okay, we have 3 questions in the chat. So let's go to those. And then if we have time, I'll ask you a few more questions, because I feel like it's more important for other people to ask you questions than me. Okay, so, I'm just going to read these out loud for everyone. This is from Will. It says, "Hi, Sarah. Your novel makes beautiful use of white space." I was going to ask you this too, with section breaks between paragraphs. How did you arrive at this approach? What did it unlock for you? Do you have a theory or idea about its role in the work?
Thanks, Will. I think so. Originally, for a very long time, it was kind of a paragraph or chapter per page. But when we got to kind of the end of the editing process, it seemed like that was going to be too long a book. And so these kinds of the current format, which is, I'll just show you for those of you who don't have the book, a couple of paragraphs per page, kind of separated by a little glyph, was something we kind of arrived at with editorially, which was a little bit different than my original idea, which was that it was really like pulsing, like the language was kind of pulsing on the page like a thought, and that you really would turn the page every time she was in this moment or this thought. And so I think, it still is there, that feeling of like of a wave or of this push and pull, which was certainly my idea. But I wanted to just make a real distinction between these moments that accumulate and make a story, rather than having any sense of kind of flow. I didn't necessarily want it to flow. I wanted it to feel like this is someone who is surrounded by emptiness, by her own sort of solitude, and by actually kind of, she's almost alienated from language in some way. And that's a lot of the white space was sort of reflecting these silences, I guess. And so you lose
really
a little bit of that, but I still think there's quite a lot of white space on the page, which I'm happy about.
My little follow-up is, were you influenced by poetry at all? Because there's a way in which looking at it on the page, if you just sort of held this up to someone, they might think, oh, this is a long prose poem.
I think I was not a particular poet, not a particular, collection, but certainly I wanted that sense of compression that one gets in a poem. And I did, I did treat the individual sections as their own universes. And then I also wanted it to sort of come together somehow. And so both the placement of these little, pieces of thought or language and their interior coherence were really important at the same time. They were kind of, the two things I was really juggling.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so magnificent about it, is that it is quite propulsive and they do really connect while also sort of existing on these little islands by themselves. Okay, we have a few more questions. Let's see. This is from someone who would prefer to remain anonymous. This is not really a question, and I can't wait to read this book. But in another reading I recently went to, the author talked about The Sacrificial Twin, which was the novel he wrote while writing the book that was published. Oh, so maybe that is...
I love that idea, the sacrificial twin.
Yes.
Yeah. What is that? It's not just throat clearing, because it's more than that. It's building the world that you need to destroy in order to make the new world. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm the sacrificial twin. I'm gonna write that down. Thank you for that comment.
Thinking about twins that don't make it, and the surviving twin. And I just read a book that actually is a memoir in which this happens. It's really horrifying. And anyway, but there's some metaphor there.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a useful idea.
Okay, another anonymous person. How does Mara decide or end up in the US? Could she not have found an obscure part of Canada in which to go? Or did she feel a need to leave her country, and why? And this person also asks, in what time period is the book set?
So absolutely. And I thought about this quite a bit. I think, as I was building the character, I had this idea that her mother was from another country, was from the US, and meets the father who's Quebecois in, anyway, so I had this sort of backstory, and so it became, I thought to myself, no, she wants to leave and she wants to kind of cross the border. She needs to make a major exit. And I considered Nova Scotia. I thought that might be a good kind of Maine counterpart, but there was something about the US and her ability to kind of be anonymous there for some reason felt more, more possible for me somehow. Maybe because of my own experience in the US as it being this kind of large, unfriendly, no, I'm just joking, but sort of unfriendly, strange place to sort of lose herself in. I felt like it might be a little bit too familiar if she stayed in Canada, but I thought about this a lot. I know that she easily crosses the border, and not everyone easily crosses the border. And she certainly benefits from being a white woman who crosses the border with a parent who's American. You can imagine she has citizenship. So it was, part of it was narratively convenient, I think, for her to be in the States.
But it actually makes tremendous narrative sense in a way, in that the United States is a place where people go to reinvent themselves. And she's Canadian, and I think in the US we think, oh, Canada, it's the same as the US. But if she were coming to the US from, I don't know, Japan, Norway, anywhere, it would make complete sense. We would think, right, she's coming to the US to lose herself, to reinvent herself. That is, its significance in reality, but, in actual people's lives, but also in literature, right? And so it makes sense. Okay, so Hallie asks, as a writer, is it important to think about who your audience is? Is there a male or female type book? Have you had different reactions to Tides from men and women? That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, the first part of the question, I certainly was not thinking about an audience because of, what we talked about. I really didn't. The audience was, can I do this for myself? Am I able to write this? And am I able to write this in the most intimate, true way that I can, given that I have no audience, and given that, this could be something that no one reads except my very kind husband and a few friends who who agree to follow me on my long path. So I didn't think of a specific audience. I've been actually really nicely surprised at how many men have responded to the novel. I do think it's, it follows a woman very closely. It talks about intimate themes of, maternity and sort of femaleness. But I've been really nicely surprised at how moving it's been to many men and critics who are men, which I was frightened of for some reason. I mean, for good reason, probably. But so that's been a nice surprise for this book, is that it seems to speak to many different kinds of people.
Okay, we have, I hope I'm pronouncing this name right, Annie asks, we don't learn Mara's name for quite a while, which makes the beginning feel like she can be anyone and everyone. Is there a reason you reveal her name in that particular section? I love this question. I actually thought about this a lot myself and have my own answer, but I didn't write the book. So.
It's a great question. I mean, I did want her to be in some way, not every person, that person doesn't exist, but to be not quite someone even to herself. And because it is such an interior beginning, right? She's so alone, she's so isolated. I think her identity is really pretty fluid at this point. She's lost a lot of herself. And so I did want her to be in some way a little bit of a cipher. And the first time that her name is revealed is when it's pronounced by, spoken out loud by Jean, this woman who sort of takes care of her sort of fairy godmother in some sense. And I thought it was important that someone else say her name, someone else kind of like rouse her from this pretty internal, isolated place. And it's true, I think it happens maybe a third of the way through the book. And that decision was, I changed it a few times, but I wanted her to be made real in connection to someone else, in relationship, basically.
We have a couple more questions. Let's see if we have time. Okay, so another anonymous person asks, how did you think about time as you worked on this book, both in terms of the overall arc and then in terms of the bursts of language and thought from page to page?
It's a great question, and it was really something I found very challenging. I knew I needed time to be somewhat compressed, but I also wanted there to be seasonal changes because I wanted there to be enough time for her to sort of, if not change, then have some variations in her mood and her memories. I think that I also in some ways was flattening the time, in that this is someone who feels like the past is as real as the present. And so when these moments from the past emerge, they emerge at the exact same level in terms of the language, right? You don't have a marker that says this was happening 10 years ago. These thoughts are as alive to her. These thoughts of the past, of her family, these moments of language that she keeps remembering are as alive to her as the present moment. And so that was important to me too, that these two things coexist kind of at the same level of importance for the character.
I love that. That's okay. This is our last question, so I think our timing is good. Have you begun to think about what's next? That's a scary question. This is from John.
I'm sorry?
It's from John Allen.
Oh, John Allen. Thank you, John, for that question. So I have, and I was mentioning this to Joanna a little bit earlier. I'm thinking of something, and it's so unbelievably different from this book, and so it scares me slightly. It's a much more kind of, I would say, sort of socially realistic coming of age story that as I begin to write it feels so unbelievably tonally different from this. But we'll see, I might have to have that sacrificial twin and see what happens. But I'm sort of hovering around some ideas there.
So I think we have 1 second or so, or I'm exaggerating. We have a couple of minutes. So maybe I'll just ask you one of the questions that I ask almost everyone when I do these, which is, what have you read recently that you've loved? What's on your nightstand right now?
Well, I have my little pile of books here because I keep my books on my desk at the moment, but I'm reading this beautiful collection of poems by Sandra Lim, The Curious Thing. She's actually a Cambridge-based writer, and a friend sent this to me in the mail anonymously. I had no idea who it came from. And so I read them with this so much excitement, and they're really lovely. And I'm also reading your wonderful book, Joanna, A Fortunate Age, which I hadn't read before, and is a great sort of social drama, and so full of the world, parties and friend groups and interactions with other people. So I think for the pandemic, that's been incredible. And one last book, because I should show you all this book. This is a friend of mine. His book is coming out in March. It's a collection of short stories, Exactly What You Mean. And they're set on the island of Guernsey, and they're really beautiful and kind of like Tessa Hadley-esque, but with an edge. So really lovely.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bonnie from the Booksmith is going to come on in just a second, and maybe she can answer this. I just want to encourage everyone to buy Tides. If you've come to this, especially, it seems like more than I expected if you guys had read it since the book just came out. But those of you who haven't, you should definitely buy it from the Booksmith. I don't know if people can purchase it now, like if they can click a button that's like, buy this book or not.
I can pop on in and answer that question.
Yes,
yeah, there's I just dropped a link in the chat, which will be live until 9 a.m. tomorrow. So anyone who either hasn't yet bought the book, needs to buy 10 copies for all their friends, anything like that, you can order from the link that is in the chat, and you can get a signed and personalized copy, which is very exciting and very special. Especially because, not being able to meet in person, it's nice to have that little physical memento. So yeah, thank you to everyone who already has ordered the book. Thank you to our incredible audience who has just been blowing up the chat. Sarah, I'm not sure if you got a chance to read some of these really lovely messages, so I'm gonna take the liberty of kind of summarizing some for you. But Noreen said that this is amazing. She loved hearing about all the details behind the writing and the format, and loved the final book. Someone else commented, who was that? That it's gone, Noreen said it's gone too fast. Gabrielle said she loves the idea that the book is a release valve from a different previous attempt. There's just been, of course, a flood of congratulations, hoorays, and clapping, and people were just so enthusiastic about the book. So I know it's hard to read the comments when you are in the middle of a conversation. So I just want to make sure that you see some of the nice things that that folks have been saying in the chat.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming.
Yeah, it was really a truly insightful, wonderful conversation. So thank you, Sara, and thank you, Joanna, for your time and your generosity. This is truly just one of the best kinds of author conversations, in my opinion. Really lovely to listen to. So yeah, be sure, I'll drop that link one more time if anyone needs it. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you to our audience and to our authors for another lovely literary evening. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.